Welcome back to Misguided the podcast, where we explore how we come to believe what we believe and what we can do about it. I'm your host, Matthew Facciani. Today's episode is a deep dive into education, misinformation, and what it really means to help students become thoughtful, informed citizens in an increasingly complex world. I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Meuwissen, a former high school teacher turned professor of education at the University of Rochester, whose work sits right at the intersection of civic learning, teacher development, and the challenges of teaching about politics, history, and disinformation in today's classrooms. We talk about how Kevin's early experiences in a rural high school shaped the questions he now explores in his research, including how students engage with history and politics, and why so many don't see school as relevant to their lives. We also dig into the groundbreaking professional learning cadre he leads, which helps social science teachers confront disinformation and political polarization head-on. Let's get into it. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to dive into your research and what you found about working with teachers. But before we dive into what you've been working on lately, I was wondering if you could share with my listeners a little bit more about your journey into studying higher education. So my understanding is you were a high school teacher before, or you had some experience with secondary education directly, and then now you're a professor of education. So what was that journey like?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks. Thanks for asking. So I started teaching high school in a rural district in upstate New York that demographically was kind of interesting. It was a combination of sort of farmers and a farming community, as well as folks affiliated with a regional college that was also in that same community. So there were lots of different kinds of folks there. And as I was teaching social studies there, I taught U.S. history. I also taught participation in government and economics and global history. I developed a couple of sort of noticings and wonderings in my first few years of teaching. So one of the things that I noticed is that students' questions and conversations about history and politics and the ways that those things manifest in their lives didn't actually get a ton of airtime in the formal curriculum. And another thing that I noticed was that some of the students didn't necessarily see high school as relevant to their imagined lives afterwards. Some saw it as highly relevant, and others, saw it as, hoops to jump through to get to where they wanted to go, but didn't necessarily, think of it as anything especially formative. So on that first, noticing about kids' questions and conversations not necessarily getting a ton of airtime, one of the more formative sort of experiences that I had was one in which I was talking to a group of kids. It was nearby Seneca Falls, which is where the Women's Rights National Historic Park is in Seneca Falls, New York. And it was right around the time of the 150th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention. We were having a field trip to the Seneca Falls, to the Women's Rights National Historical Park. And I was part of a conversation among a group of students about what a field visit like that ought to do for young people. And, one of the students said, I like seeing old places and reenactments and stuff. And another said, I don't really care. I just get to spend a day out of school. That's kind of fun. And then somebody else indicated, well, I want to sort of pay attention to like what we can learn about how women changed society in ways that are relevant to today. And I sort of asked this question, like, we have different ideas about that. So what should, sites that commemorate historical events and phenomena actually do? And they thought that was an interesting question. It was one that they hadn't been asked to think about before. And so it's an example of a circumstance in which kids were thinking about things that were relevant to their lives and their community that they hadn't necessarily been asked to think about in school. And I thought, well, why don't we ask kids to think about those kinds of things? With regard to some students not seeing school as being as relevant to their imagined lives afterwards as we might hope as educators, I'm remembering a conversation with the father of a student who, the dad was a farmer, his dad was a farmer, the kid was going to be a farmer. And he said, school's good for my kid socially, but I don't know the subject matter that you're teaching. That's your area of expertise. I can't help them with it. I'm not all that interested in it. And then, the kid's going to graduate from high school, come back to the farm, and he's probably never going to need it again after that. And I thought that seemed kind of, shocking, but it also seemed kind of high stakes. Like we don't have that much time with some high school kids to put them in a place where they're with different kinds of people exploring questions about history and politics and those sorts of things. And so we really need to make sure that we take advantage of that time when we've got it. So I left, high school teaching with a couple of wonderings, one of which was, well, how do we what do we do when you have different kinds of kids in a space where they're talking history and politics with each other, and how do we help them understand each other and understand each other's ideas about those things and their backgrounds and their commitments and all that? And then what do we do about the noticings that I mentioned in terms of kids' questions and conversations not necessarily being part of the formal curriculum, and kids not necessarily seeing high school as relevant to their lives afterwards. So that's when I went into my doctoral program at the University of Maryland. And there I worked with folks who studied those sorts of questions about, the relevance of history to kids' lives, how do we help kids investigate questions that are relevant to them? How do we help them sort of corroborate different sources of historical evidence? How do we help them engage in inquiry and investigation and argumentation about historical circumstances, but also about the relevance of historical circumstances to the present? And from there, I went into teacher preparation. I've been at the University of Rochester, where I came after my PhD program concluded at Maryland. I've been here for about 15 years, addressing those kinds of questions with pre-service teachers, also working with practicing teachers in the field in professional learning settings like the social studies cadre that we built and enacted last year related to disinformation in the social studies classroom, and also doing research in schools with teachers and kids around questions like, are open-minded citizens mythological creatures, and those sorts of things. So I'm doing work primarily now related to teacher professional learning and understanding how young people develop as sort of political thinkers and actors.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. I mean, it's super cool to hear that you're able to get direct teaching experience and see it from the side as the high school teacher and see the challenges that they faced directly and personally, and then tackle this from a different perspective as a researcher and someone who works with teachers. So I wanted to then dive more into that cadre you mentioned. Since, I study misinformation myself, I'm very interested in this topic. I'm curious kind of how that came to be and what that process has been like.
Yeah, great question. So the social studies professional learning cadre at the University of Rochester actually comes from our Center for Professional Development Ed Reform, has had cadres in mathematics education for a long time, addressing questions about inquiry and investigation in mathematics and kids' math, identities as mathematicians. And one of the
Mhm.
things that I did a couple of years ago was I worked with the folks in that center to expand that program in social studies education to address some questions that I heard from teachers and administrators in the field that they felt that professional learning experiences weren't necessarily addressing. And so I thought, well, can I build a social studies cadre to address questions related to learning and teaching in social studies? So the cadre is really sort of a working group of educators that's committed to supporting high quality teaching by staying abreast of research and resources, and then building a community of social studies educators in places where those communities may or may not exist, with the purpose of improving social studies learning for all. And one of the questions that shows up regularly among teachers in the cadre, and that that school leaders were also asking about, was, how do we help teachers, teach difficult and controversial things like contentious or difficult histories and political polarization and disinformation
Mhm.
and so forth? So our first, sort of aim is to engage with current research on the subject matter. And this year, in 24-25, that subject matter was disinformation in the social studies classroom. And what's interesting related to the research related to disinformation is that it's evolving in real time around us. And so it's not a professional learning experience where we can go into the workshops or the seminars and say, well, we have 50 years of research on learning
Mhm.
this, and we know based on that research all of these things. These are the circumstances that we're facing in society and in schools right now, and the research is
Mhm.
evolving. We're drawing a lot from scholarship that's coming out in 22, 23, 24, et cetera, and trying to think about the implications of that for classrooms and for teachers, and then sharing ideas and strategies and materials that promote powerful student learning related to disinformation. I think the thing that I just mentioned that's also really important is the idea of cultivating a community that supports social studies teachers and teaching amidst our current conditions and challenges. So I've mentioned that this
Mhm.
professional learning cadre was something that we did in the 24-25 school year. So our first session was pre-election in late October. Our second session was pre-inauguration in January. Our third and fourth sessions were post-inauguration. So each time we have a professional learning session with the teachers, there's this new set of conditions
Right.
politically and socially and culturally also related to disinformation that we have to address. So in terms of, the folks who participated in the cadre, this program year, as I mentioned, was our second year. Our first year focused on discussing difficult histories. We had about 30 folks in the cadre, and 2/3 of them came back from the first to the second year. So we're really building this community network of regional educators who connect and collaborate both in and beyond the cadre, some of whom, as I mentioned, are the only folks in their schools sometimes thinking very seriously about issues related to disinformation and political polarization and such, and trying to address them in sometimes very contentious spaces, right? So the ecologies of folks' schools make a big difference. There's rural schools, there are urban schools. So interestingly, one of the things that we talked about when we were talking about what kinds of community do you work in? What are your classrooms like? What are your schools like? Your community, your region? What are the state influences on what happens in your classrooms and schools? These are conversations that we had. During that conversation, one of the teachers in our rural district talked about the impact of Moms for Liberty on her district school board and PTA. And a
Hmm.
colleague in the cadre in a nearby urban district unsarcastically asked in response, "What's a mom for liberty?" And so consequently, like, we're having these conversations among teachers across different kinds of demographics and different kinds of political conditions, and addressing fundamentally challenging open-ended problems related to mis and disinformation together across those contexts. We've gotten feedback from the teachers in the program that, we're really glad to have this community. It's given them opportunities to experience interactions that they might adapt for their students that they might not necessarily engage in otherwise. This past year, we sort of established sort of a compelling question for the whole year in terms of the subject matter for us to collectively deal with, and then some supporting questions. So we built the cadre as kind of an inquiry, just like we would ask teachers to build curriculum units around inquiry questions. And the inquiry question that grounded our cadre for the year was, how do mis and disinformation generate conditions for political violence? And it was something that we spent a lot of time talking about. And then in each of the sessions, we started the session with sort of an experience as learners where we would ask them to do things together that they might ask their students to do together. And then we would delve into research and their understandings of the research and their thoughts about the implications thereof. We had a book club that we enacted this year, and the book that we used was Mike Caulfield and Sam Weinberg's book, Verified, which everybody loved. And then we had them think about subject matter that they might teach and build curriculum around the subject matter that they might teach. So as I mentioned, our key question or our compelling question, our inquiry question for the year was, how do mis and disinformation generate conditions for political violence? And then each of the sessions, we had, smaller supporting questions related to that. So the first session, we asked the question, it was in the context of the Rwandan genocide. How did Hutus use media and messaging to incite hatred and violence toward Tutsis in Rwanda, with a focus on how specific pieces of disinformation, had sort of manipulative effects? The second question was, in the second session, was, how did pre and post January 6th disinformation campaigns function to both encourage and encourage violence prior to January 6th and then dismiss violence after January 6th, which focused on, disinformation as a kind of systemic long-term campaign. And then the third question that we addressed in session 3 was, how did the Nazis manipulate youth to create conditions that promoted cultural revolution, regime change, and a more violent society, focusing both on discrete kinds of disinformation, but also as a campaign of disinformation? And from that, we drew from a curriculum that had come out in the UK in the 70s that basically, and it was a curriculum related to Nazification and how it happened and why it happened, and the role of information, disinformation, propaganda, and manipulation in the process of Nazification. So they got to see, a curriculum that seems really old, but also is super, relevant to the present. And so those are the kinds of things that we have done in the cadre sessions, again, sort of focusing both on experiences as learners, and research into practice as a way of helping the teachers think about how they might exercise some of their own curricular and instructional decision making to make disinformation more of a core part of their curriculum.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's awesome. I definitely find that very encouraging to see this research about misinformation and how we're susceptible to misinformation be more broadly accessible to teachers and help them incorporate it in their curriculums. I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about some of the specifics of this curriculum. One thing that caught my eye when I was looking over your slides was the section that dove into the social factors of misinformation susceptibility. And, that's the big perspective I have in my own work, is looking at how identities and social networks influence misinformation. So I was wondering if you could just talk about what that looked like in practice whenever you were diving into these topics.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we developed for this cadre was because, mis and disinformation are sort of challenging concepts, we've thought it would be important to have a conceptual framework for the program that helped teachers who are part of the program sort of understand it in terms that they're familiar with, and to understand the consequences of mis and disinformation both individually and socially in terms that they were familiar with. So we developed a conceptual framework, and I know you've had Claire Wardle on the program to talk to, where we sort of talked about the effects of mis and disinformation as things that create a kind of disordered information ecosystem. And then we talked about mis and disinformation as kind of infectants that lead to social and individual illnesses, or kind of sort of like an infodemic. We kind of used
Mm-hmm.
COVID as a metaphor because, of course, everybody has direct experience with the COVID pandemic, right? We talked about, in order to address, illness in that sort of capacity, or illness of that scope, there are really three things that, we need to do. We need healthy lifestyles. We need to maintain healthy lifestyles. Unhealthy people are more susceptible to disease, right? So the healthier you are,
Mm-hmm.
the less susceptible you are to disease. But regardless of lifestyle, different kinds of people are going to be exposed, to infectants. And so there are a couple of things that we need to do related to that. One is to inoculate, right, to prepare the body for the infectant. And then another
Mm-hmm.
is, once the infectant arrives, despite our lifestyle efforts and despite the fact that we may have been inoculated or not, we're still exposed to them. So despite those conditions, people are going to be exposed to and contract the disease, so treatments are needed. And so we talked about those three things as things that we as educators ought to do with young people to help them understand disinformation and how it works, and to sort of protect them from disinformation. So one is to establish healthy information lifestyles, socially.
Mm-hmm.
Another is, to sort of inoculate students, or to engage in, what's come to be known as sort of pre-bunking or inoculation. And what's interesting about inoculation in terms of how we've talked about it is, we talk about it in the same way that you see in, folks like, Van Linden and colleagues, van der Linden and colleagues research related to, establishing a kind of indicator that they're going to be attacked by something, to sort of show them how manipulation works, to give them a low stakes example of it so that they can see what those things are going to entail when they see manipulative content elsewhere. And then treatments, debunking, for example, is a form of treatment. And we used, again, going back to Caulfield and Weinberg's book, this sort of SIFT strategy for debunking. So we
Mm-hmm.
taught, a variety of different things related to lifestyle strategies, as well as inoculation strategies and treatment strategies, acknowledging too that, again, the research related to the effectiveness of these strategies is either non-existent sometimes, or evolving, or
Mm-hmm.
sometimes even it points us in different directions. I know there's, with regard to the research on inoculation, there are, different conclusions that people are drawing about under what conditions inoculations work, how long they last, et cetera, et cetera. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these things, a lot of the research related to these things, we're trying to sort of transform and translate into forms that teachers in the program can understand, and can think about relative to the kinds of work that they would want to do with their students, to sort of address disinformation together. So in terms of building healthy information lifestyles, for example, social practices are necessary to engage in healthy information lifestyles, right? So, one thing that I think is important for us to do is to not treat thoughtful, careful engagement with mis and disinformation as a sidebar. Teachers need to work with students around disinformation on the regular. So that's one thing that's important with regard to building healthy information lifestyles in the classroom. Another thing that teachers can do is to disclose to their students what their aims and goals are for addressing disinformation together, to talk about, why it's important to students and to a democratic society to address disinformation, what kinds of difficult or uncomfortable things teachers and students might actually encounter and confront when they're dealing with disinformation, and to sort of disclose, we're going to do this together. Here's why we're going to do it. So you should be prepared for the kinds of conversations that we're going to have related to the validity or credibility of information, and related to the idea that there are campaigns of disinformation that are designed to have particular kinds of political effects. One of the most important things that we discuss, though, is establishing, norms and expectations for how we're going to be together in a classroom and how we're going to learn together related to disinformation. So, what are the learning spaces that we need where, we're actually effectively addressing mis and disinformation? In terms of establishing those norms and expectations, there are a couple of different kinds of norms and expectations that are important. One is general sorts of norms and expectations for how we're going to be together. And then another is norms and expectations that are specific to, how we're going to support a healthy information lifestyle in this classroom. So, what we did together as educators in the cadre was we developed a set of agreements that support healthy information lifestyles. For example, in this space, we agree that, like citizens in a democratic society, students in a democratic classroom have a fundamental right to accurate information. In this space, we'll seek out accurate information about things like health and science and politics, because accuracy really matters to us and to the people that we care about. In this classroom space, we'll talk to each other about why we find sources of information trustworthy or not. We will also, when we come upon a new source of information, we'll pause to make sure we know what we're looking at, and we'll check our own feelings and beliefs about it. We will not assume that when someone shares inaccuracies or misleading information, it means their values or beliefs are bad. So, these are the kinds
Hmm.
of things that are important for sort of cultivating a social space in which people can, work together to sort of address disinformation explicitly, which is something that absolutely needs to happen. We need to sort of normalize the process in classrooms of addressing disinformation explicitly as opposed to addressing it as a sidebar, and, checking source credibility and having conversations about how we know what we know in both, learning in regular learning activities, but also like assessments of learning as things that, have stakes for students and teachers.
Yeah, so you're really diving into the process of information gathering and deciding, yeah, kind of like a philosophical almost perspective of like what is knowledge and how do we know if something's more true versus less true. And I think that's great. I mean, that process is definitely something that should be taught. And I think there's a lot of value to thinking about that rather than so much on even like the labels of if something's misinformation or not. It sounds like you're more about the process. And that's what I try to do with my writing and the stuff that I do over here is really diving into how we know what we know and where trust comes from. It's tricky because eventually you need to give some concrete examples of if something's true or false. You can't completely dance around it. But I think there's a lot of value to just focusing on the social factors of how we form beliefs too.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the things that I think we don't spend a ton of time doing in classrooms is actually talking with kids about the social dynamics, the cultural dynamics, and the psychological dynamics associated with how we come to know what we know. And so
Hmm.
it's important, for example, for kids to understand, for example, what motivated reasoning is and how it works and how they engage in it and how they practice it in order to have a sort of metacognitive understanding of the ways in which people take in information, the extent to which they, why, for example, they believe in a source of information, or why they choose to spread information, right? There
Hmm.
are, social and psychological and cultural factors that are at play in that process. So, we talk about, for example, having conversations with your kids about sharing a piece of information for a purpose. And what are the different purposes that we have in terms of sharing information? Well, some may say, well, it's because I saw something and I couldn't believe it was true, and I wanted to find out if other people, saw the same thing. And there are also variations of, well, I know that this aligns with the kinds of things that I believe and the kind of person that I think that I am. So I shared information with other people because it reinforces my own sort of beliefs and values and so on and so forth. These are reasons why people share information that's both credible and not credible. And we talk to teachers about how to have conversations with their students, not only about the subject matter that they're learning, but about how and why they engage with that subject matter in particular kinds of ways, which is really important because it acknowledges the role of both them as individuals and groups and people that they're committed to in making decisions about sharing information and having an understanding about what they know, why they know it, and how they came to know it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's great. I'm curious now about how that process and more generally this process of doing curriculum design can change depending on the location of the school. I know that you published an article a few years ago about teaching about climate change and climate change education in more rural conservative areas and some of the challenges and changes in the curriculum for that topic. And I was curious if you could reflect anything about that paper from a few years ago, or even just more broadly about challenges of teaching these more sensitive topics as you go across different places in the United States.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I'll get to that question in just a second. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago how it's interesting to have these conversations about how people come to know what they know, think what they think, and share what they share abstractly. But what are some practical examples or specific
Hmm.
examples related to how that works? So one of the things that we did together in the professional learning cadre, one of the experiences as learners that we engaged in together, right around the time of Hurricane Helene, there were a series of pieces of disinformation that were being spread about federal responses to the hurricane. And one of the tasks that we engaged in together was a task where we asked them to we called it the credibility continuum. And on one end of the spectrum, we had not at all credible. And on the other end of the spectrum, we had highly credible. And the question was, which sources of information do you think would be credible or trustworthy relative to information coming out around the federal response to Hurricane Helene? And there were all sorts of different types of sources, from an official statement from a county emergency management office, or, a tweet by Elon Musk, or hearsay from your mother-in-law who reads Facebook a lot, or, like all of these different kinds of sources. And we asked the teachers to place these different kinds of sources on this continuum, and then to look at how different teachers placed these sources in different places, and have conversations about why they place things where they place things, what they think and know about those sources relative to the question at hand, and where there are similarities and differences, which attends to that agreement that I mentioned before about we'll talk to each other about, in this classroom, we will talk to each other about why we find sources of information trustworthy or not. It's a very
Hmm.
specific way to go about doing that. And actually, it reveals different ways of thinking about the credibility of information based on where it comes from and what it's about. One of the things that I think is really important for teachers to think about and for students to have opportunities to do is to engage in social interactions around these issues, whereby the social interactions that kids engage in, like their social and cultural and intellectual resources that come out of those interactions, become part of the curriculum. Kids' resources are really important for thinking through these issues. And we can draw from, all sorts of different sources of information, but one of the most important sources is the thinking of the students that are in the classroom there with you. And those kinds of thinking tasks allow us to get to that kind of thinking. So, coming back to your question about what are some ways in which, the article that you mentioned, what is climate change education in Trump country? What are some ways that you can get folks to have conversations about, credible information and to engage in productive dialogue among different kinds of students? The things that we learned through that article. Well, one of the things is that engaging in that kind of collaborative or collective thinking together is effective. But there's a bunch of other things too. So the context of that article is that the first two authors, David Long and Joe Henderson, taught climate science to undergrads actually in a relatively rural conservative higher education setting for both. And both the instructors, David and Joe, both came from relatively rural conservative settings themselves. So they were able to
Hmm.
share their own backgrounds and lessons learned and conversations with their own community members about climate science with their students in a way that sort of lent legitimacy to their stances with their students. And then they shared their positionalities accordingly. They sort of modeled, this is who I am, this is how I came to think what I think about climate science. These are the people that I'm committed to. This is my background, et cetera. Now you think that way as well to their students and articulate how you're thinking about those things, make a difference in terms of your ideas about climate and the environment and the extractive industries that exist in the places where you come from and your ideas about science. So they encouraged a lot of students' sort of meta-political epistemic awareness relative to climate science. And what I mean by that is like how their values, their backgrounds, and their social and cultural commitments and their experiences and even their emotions related to those things interact with their ideas about how we come to know things and
Hmm.
how science works as a way of coming to know things. And that was a regular conversation that occurred, or those were regular kinds of conversations that occurred in those classroom spaces. The instructors engaged in a lot of modeling and their own disclosures about these things alongside their students. Another thing that happened in those spaces that I think was really important is a focus on sort of superordinate narratives and questions. And what I mean by that is, narratives and questions that people from all different kinds of walks of life and experiences can engage in and ought to be thinking about as, questions that are important to them. So, for example, in David's course, one of his narratives throughout the course was, you as students will have ownership of the future through local decision making, through the social and economic institutions in which you might find yourselves living and working. All of you are going to share that experience. And inevitably, all of that is going to be affected by the relationship between climate and your physical environment and the resources that you have at your disposal. So, big question, how ought we make decisions and why ought we make decisions in those ways relative to environmental protection or degradation or resource use or sort of how we think about climate and what we ought to do relative to climate and in our environment. And so that sort of how ought we make decisions. One of the things that is important about that question, it's a normative question, and they sort of distinguish the question as a normative question and then reinforce the idea that in order to address a normative question and discuss it, you have to also address some empirical questions, some like what do we know
Hmm.
questions and how do we know it? So how are we going to address empirical questions in such a way where we're all pretty confident that we're working from the base from a common base of credible, valid, accurate information, which will allow us to have conversations about the normative questions because the information that we're drawing from to do that is good information. So that kind of thing was really important to the work that they did with their students. And in doing that, they explicitly focused on the credibility of sources of online information about climate and science and, investigations of like the political intents of particular sources or things that they did with
Hmm.
students. They did not necessarily get the same sort of positive responses from all of the students to the work that they did. But I think one of the things that's important is, again, doing that work alongside just the work of, looking at science related to climate and having conversations about what it means. It's looking at the students in the class, their identities, who they are as a group, where they come from, and how those things affect the way that they engage with climate science. That was really important. And then another thing that I think is important to mention is something that they did in their undergraduate classroom is consistent with something that we did with the teachers in our high school social studies learning cadre. And something that I mentioned previously is important for cultivating, good lifestyle practices with regard to information is setting norms and expectations and building agreements collectively for how we are together in this learning space relative to the things that we're reading and discussing and
Hmm.
learning. So some of the disinformation focused agreements that made their way into the professional learning cadre actually existed and came from, David's and Joe's and my paper. So for example, we seek out accurate information because it's really consequential to us and the people we care about. That was a norm in their classrooms. Another one was because there are stakes associated with protecting our values and commitments and worldviews that make us susceptible to misinformation or manipulation. We're going to pause to check the consequences of our values and commitments when we read something or see something. And another one that I thought was really interesting, that established a kind of a foundation of values in their classroom, was this idea that there are great costs in our learning environment of making bad arguments and sowing mistrust and sabotaging norms of constructive interaction. There are costs to our community, our learning community, for doing that. So we're not going to do those things. Like, that was sort of a pledge that they had all of the students talk through and pledge. And that's really important too. What I just mentioned about having students talk to and pledge these norms and expectations are not things that came just from the teachers, passed down to the students, where the students said, yeah, okay, we understand and agree with these things. Like, they're things that were negotiated, discussed, rephrased, reframed, to really sort of demonstrate that students understand them, and B, to sort of cultivate commitment to those things. Like, yes, these are things that we can agree with because we feel like we've had a stake in and we've participated in the process of, creating them. And I think that's also really important too, is giving, students the opportunity to sort of think about what these norms and agreements ought to be. Like, teachers, of course, could and should create a kind of, I don't know, a set of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, proposed norms and agreements, but having students engage with those and think about how to amend them is really important for a commitment to those things in their classrooms.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think there's a lot of work showing that this collaboration aspect is really important for fostering trust and productive dialogue. And it's interesting to see it across different domains. But I mean, it's all about the social psychology behind it. If you're actually working with someone and they're not just talking down to you, it makes a big difference. So it makes sense that would be the same case in the classroom as well.
Yeah, for sure. We had an interesting experience related to those agreements in the context of the cadre. So we did the same sort of thing with the teachers in the cadre. We proposed some ideas for agreements. They talked about them in our first session together. They added ideas, they made modifications, and then we came up with a sort of collaboratively set of agreements. As members of this professional learning community, we will do these things. And they include things like, be present and engaged in our work together, expect uncertainty, discomfort, and unfinished business, have the humility needed for others to impact my thinking, trust in the good intentions of others while owning my own intentions, communicating explicitly when I need time to think, and permission to speak a rough draft of my thinking, and those sorts of things. And then part of the way throughout the professional learning program, we started having conversations about the extent to which, teachers always have sort of a moral leadership stance in their classroom, particularly relative to disinformation and relative to information that they don't want students sharing or perpetuating in their classroom, right? And so as the professional learning cadre went on, we worked with them in a way where we asked them to do things that we would also expect for them to model and do with their own students. So we said, okay, we feel like it's time, based on these conversations regarding, sort of teachers' moral authority in the classroom, we think it's time to introduce, amendments to our agreements, amending our norms to sort of meet evolving needs and conditions in our learning community, related to something that we keep talking about. So we proposed two sort of moral authority amendments to our previous professional learning agreements. One was, as a member of this professional learning community, I will always assume the stance of moral leadership in the classroom, and I will reinforce the principle that some ideas are actually not valid in the classroom. And the ways that they talked about those things, like, that was a really sort of rich and interesting conversation, because there was a lot of disagreement about those ideas and the extent to which, should we use always when we talk about moral leadership? Some ideas are not valid in the classroom. Do we want to reinforce that, which might, turn students against, the teacher or each other, as if they're not sort of open-minded. So we had all of these conversations about these quote unquote, moral authority amendments to our original agreements. And, when you mentioned, it's important to collaboratively or collectively have conversations about trust, one of the things that I thought about was the ways in which those conversations evolve over time as we dig deeper into problems associated with the subject matter that we're studying. So, as we delved as teachers deeper into, what it means to understand disinformation, to teach about it, to have kids talking about it. These kinds of problems emerged in our conversation, or dilemmas emerged in our conversation that required us to sort of address them in real time.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's just fascinating to see it all in an applied setting, some of the research that I've been reading about in a more laboratory setting. So I wanted to wrap up this conversation with a broader question of what do you think would be the biggest change that you would implement if you could change high school curriculums across the United States more broadly? I know it's a big question, big picture. So is there any like specific things that you think could be changed that could make education better for everyone?
First and foremost, sort of going back to the idea of superordinate goals and problems and so on and so forth. I think all of the world's real problems are interdisciplinary problems. So, for example, the politicization of climate science, racial and ethnic conflict, the ways in which sort of fractured media landscape and proliferation of AI might affect our collective capacities to name and solve shared problems. Like, these are interdisciplinary things. This is not the domain
Right.
only of math or science or history or politics and government.
Hmm.
So if all of the world's problems are truly interdisciplinary problems, and school subject areas and curricula generally are not designed to focus on interdisciplinary problems, I mean, we still have math is math, science is science, English language arts is English language arts. A lot of these kinds of problems may not enter young people's collective consciousness in school settings in ways where they're represented as sort of interdisciplinary problems that affect all of us in large ways, and that we have to actually leverage different kinds of disciplinary tools to address. So I think that's one big issue. I don't know that the way that the school curriculum, broadly speaking, is structured effectively addresses these kinds of superordinate goals and broad problems. I think a bigger systemic issue, of course, is the wide variability in educational resources across school communities, demographics, states, et cetera. Underfunded schools in rural and urban communities, for example. There's, racial, socioeconomic, and cultural segregation of schools in ways that perpetuate racial, socioeconomic, and cultural segregation in society.
Hmm.
Like in upstate New York, where I am, districts organized the way that they are often highly racially and socioeconomically segregated in and around urban areas. And I think that sort of divergence is problematic because some people have access to opportunities to really think hard about these sorts of issues, and other students don't have access to those kinds of opportunities because they're concerned with other things, i.e., keeping schools open and raising test scores and so on and so forth. So those are challenges. I also think,
Hmm.
policy landscapes themselves also potentially generate significant divergence in curriculum, in learning and assessment and instruction, and they can exacerbate some of the social and political polarization that exists across communities and districts. So an example that I'm thinking of, well, is an example where the extent to which public schools are perceived of as trustworthy places for students and to learn and develop is actually potentially endangered by outright falsehoods advanced in policy. So in Oklahoma, a new state social studies standard indicates that students have to identify discrepancies in the 2020 elections
Hmm.
by treating as legitimate and credible a whole bunch of tactics and information that the Stop the Steal folks used that have been, repeatedly shown in courts, journalism, academic scholarship, et cetera, to be not legitimate and not credible. I
Hmm.
mean, that kind of standard would never exist in many other states, which brings us to increasingly the problem of educational systems being sort of wrapped up in the challenge of different members of society simply having different partisan realities and worldviews as part of the things that they're potentially learning about. So I think that's a real challenge. I don't know how risky or how problematic that challenge is at the moment. Increasingly we hear sort of idiosyncratic or anecdotal examples of changes, but when a policy structure at the state level, i.e., standards, is changed to reinforce a conception of knowledge that just is not accurate or not true, that becomes, really problematic. Related to that, a question that I think is worth considering is how well schools are prepared for and how quickly they can adapt in curriculum, instruction, policy, funding, professional development, et cetera, to rapid changes in the sort of disordered information landscape in which students and community members, currently live. Schools are pretty slow moving institutions in the sense that they don't generally adapt very quickly to changes in the world around them. So I'm concerned about schools' capacities to adapt well to the kinds of cultural, political, and socioeconomic and informational dilemmas that we face. You can talk about, history education specifically. Not only are we sort of struggling to figure out how to teach kids what kinds of history they should be learning and in what ways during an especially politically charged time. Those conversations are all over the place with regard to, curriculum constraints and changes and things that are being banned from schools via policy, both statewide and locally. But also, like, how will technology affect the kinds of historical thinking that we're trying to get students to do, and the kinds of meta-political thinking that we're trying to get students to do, from interpreting and corroborating discrepant sources of evidence, which in some cases may or may not be real. Like if a generated quote unquote evidence looks like actual evidence, what do we do? How do we deal with that?
Right.
And then, we want students to construct original arguments in response to, open-ended historical questions, which, they may or may not have large language models do, with and for them. So I think there's a lot of things that are changing at the moment, and the extent to which schools are able to address all of those changes simultaneously is something that I'm definitely concerned about.
Yeah, I am as well. But I'm glad you're diving into this and working directly with students as we navigate this rapidly evolving information age, especially with artificial intelligence and everything going on with their information ecosystem. But I really enjoyed talking with you today and learning about your work and your thoughts about how we can improve education, especially in relates to teaching about misinformation. So thank you so much for joining me. It was great to talk with you today.
Yeah, Matthew, thanks a bunch for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. This is a great podcast.
Thank you.